When a team of archaeologists excavates a site, they are not uncovering history the way you might uncover a buried treasure chest, intact and waiting to be opened. What they are actually doing is something far more methodical and, if we're being honest, far more uncertain than that. They are collecting fragments, partial impressions, and broken remnants of human activity, and then attempting to reconstruct from those pieces something coherent enough to call knowledge. The distinction matters enormously, because most of what gets reported as established ancient history is not a direct observation of the past. It is an interpretation built on whatever happened to survive the last several thousand years. Consider something as simple as a ceramic vessel found during an excavation in the Near East. On its own, a broken pot tells you almost nothing of substance. It was made somewhere, used for something, and ended up in the ground at some point. But when that same vessel is found at a specific depth within a stratified sequence of soil layers surrounded by ash, animal bones, and the collapsed mud brick of what appears to be a domestic structure, it starts to accumulate meaning. The depth suggests an approximate period. The ash suggests fire. The bones suggest food preparation or consumption. The structure suggests a household rather than a ceremonial space. None of those conclusions is certain. Each one is an inference built on what we know about similar patterns at comparable sites. And that inferential chain, running from a broken piece of fired clay all the way to a statement about how people lived in a particular region during a particular century, is essentially what ancient history is built from. The reason this is worth understanding clearly is that the gap between what the evidence actually shows and what we confidently assert about the ancient world is often much wider than popular accounts suggest. Mainstream documentaries tend to present ancient history as a more or less complete picture with a few gaps around the edges. If we actually look at how the discipline operates, a more accurate description is nearly the opposite. An enormous expanse of uncertainty with a relatively small number of points where the evidence is dense and reliable enough to support strong conclusions. That is not a criticism of archaeology or of the historians working within it. It is just the reality of trying to reconstruct human activity across timescales of centuries and millennia from whatever debris happened not to decompose. Here is the problem that sits at the center of this entire field. Archaeology is not a recording discipline. It does not play back the past. It reasons toward the past from physical traces that are incomplete by definition, biased by the conditions of preservation, and interpreted through frameworks that are themselves products of the present. The same set of burned buildings at an excavated site can be read as evidence of military conquest, accidental fire, or intentional ritual destruction, and the physical remains alone do not resolve that question. The conclusions we reach depend on what other evidence is available, which comparative cases we choose to apply, and which interpretive assumptions we bring to the analysis. And that distinction between what was found and what it means is where almost everything in ancient history gets complicated. Before any digging happens, a team will usually spend weeks or months just looking at the surface of a site, mapping features, collecting surface finds, running remote sensing scans to figure out what might be underground. This phase is called a survey. It is genuinely painstaking work. Teams walking systematic transects across a field, recording the position of every potsherd, every scatter of burnt material, every subtle change in vegetation that might indicate a buried wall or a filled-in ditch below. Ground-penetrating radar can detect density changes beneath the surface without disturbing a single centimeter of soil. LiDAR, which fires millions of laser pulses from an aircraft and measures the return time of each one, can strip away vegetation cover digitally and reveal the outlines of structures that have been invisible for centuries. What all of this technology has in common is that it helps researchers decide where to dig before they commit to actually doing it. This was because excavation is destructive, and you only get one chance. Here is something that surprises most people when they first encounter it. The vast majority of known archaeological sites are never fully excavated. Even famous, heavily studied sites like Pompeii still have large portions that remain untouched, deliberately preserved for future researchers who will have better tools and methods than we currently do. A typical excavation might open a series of small test trenches, carefully chosen to sample different parts of a site, rather than attempt to expose the whole thing at once. The choice of where to place those trenches is itself an interpretive act. This was because it is guided by whatever the researchers believe is most likely to be significant. If a team assumes a site was primarily a settlement, they will dig where they expect to find houses. If that assumption is wrong, they may spend an entire season digging in the wrong place and have no idea they missed something important 10 meters to the left. Once excavation begins, everything slows down considerably. Soil is removed in careful layers, each one recorded in detail before the next one is touched. This was because the sequence of those layers carries information that disappears the moment you disturb it. This principle, called stratigraphy, is built on the observation that objects deposited earlier tend to end up deeper in the ground than objects deposited later. That gives archaeologists a relative sense of sequence even before any scientific dating is applied. But stratigraphy requires almost obsessive documentation to be useful. Every artifact that emerges is assigned a precise spatial coordinate, photographed in position, logged against the layer it came from before it is moved. The relationship between an object and its surroundings is often more informative than the object itself. And this brings us to one of the most fundamental problems in archaeological evidence. That is, that what survives is not a fair sample of what existed. Stone survives, fired ceramic survives, metal, under the right conditions, survives. But wood rots, cloth disintegrates, leather deteriorates, plant material vanishes. Food leaves almost no trace unless it happens to be carbonized or sealed in an unusually dry or anaerobic environment. This means that the material record is systematically skewed toward durable goods and away from everything that made up most of daily life for most people throughout most of human history. We know a great deal about the pots a Bronze Age community used, and comparatively little about the baskets, the textiles, the perishable structures, the organic foods that were almost certainly far more central to how they actually lived. The record is not incomplete by accident. It is incomplete in a particular direction. That direction shapes every conclusion we draw from it. An object pulled out of the ground without a careful record of exactly where it sat, what was around it, what layer it came from is, in a very real sense, a clue that has already been partially destroyed. One of the most common misconceptions about ancient history is that we know when things happened with a degree of precision that the evidence simply doesn't support. Documentaries will tell you a palace was built in 1450 BC, or that a particular burial dates to roughly 2700 BC, and those numbers land with a confidence that implies someone was there, writing it down, keeping careful records. Almost none of that confidence is earned. The actual process of assigning a date to an ancient object or site is complicated, probabilistic, and often depends on multiple overlapping methods, none of which produce a single clean answer. There are two broad categories of dating that archaeologists work with, and understanding the difference between them matters enormously. Relative dating tells you the sequence of things. It tells you what came before what, which layer is older, which pottery style precedes another. It does not give you a year, absolute dating attempts to produce an actual numerical estimate of age, a number you can attach to a point on the calendar. Both approaches have real power, and both have real limitations that rarely get explained in popular accounts. Relative dating relies heavily on stratigraphy, which is the principle that in undisturbed ground, deeper layers are older than the layers above them. If you find a bronze tool sitting below a layer that contains iron tools, the bronze tool is almost certainly older. The critical caveat is that ground is almost never perfectly undisturbed. Pits are dug, burials cut through earlier layers, Roots push objects downward. Floods reshuffle deposits entirely. Stratigraphy gives you a working framework, not a guarantee. The other main form of relative dating is typology, which involves comparing the style of an artifact, the shape of a pot, the design of a brooch, the form of a blade, against a known sequence of similar objects whose rough timeline has already been established. But typology only works where a reference sequence already exists, and in regions or time periods where we have limited comparative material, it can break down quickly. Absolute dating is where the science gets more precise, though the word precise still carries important qualifications. Every living organism absorbs carbon from the environment, and a small fraction of that carbon is the radioactive isotope carbon-14. The moment an organism dies, it stops absorbing new carbon, and the carbon-14 it already contains begins to decay at a known rate. By measuring how much carbon-14 remains in an organic sample, a piece of charcoal, a fragment of bone, a seed, researchers can calculate roughly how long ago that organism died. The effective range of the method runs to approximately 50,000 years, beyond which too little carbon-14 remains to produce a reliable measurement. What radiocarbon dating produces is not a single year. It produces a statistical range. A result might come back as 3,200 BC plus or minus 80 years, which means the actual age falls somewhere within that window at a specified level of statistical confidence. That margin of error is not a flaw in the method. It is an honest statement of what the physics allows. The number you see in a textbook is typically the midpoint of that range after the raw measurement has been processed through a calibration curve, which accounts for natural fluctuations in atmospheric carbon-14 over time. For material older than radiocarbon's useful range, or for objects that contain no organic components at all, researchers turn to other methods. Dendrochronology matches the growth ring patterns in ancient timber against a master sequence of tree rings built up over centuries, and in favourable conditions it can narrow a date to a specific year or decade. Thermoluminescence measures the energy trapped in crystalline minerals since the last time they were heated, making it useful for dating fired ceramics and burned stone. Potassium-argon dating works on volcanic rock by measuring the accumulation of argon gas from the radioactive decay of potassium, and it operates on timescales of hundreds of thousands to millions of years, making it central to dating early hominin sites in East Africa, EA. Each of these methods has its own applicable range, its own requirements, and its own sources of potential error. When a textbook says a site was occupied around 3,200 BC, that number is the midpoint of a probability range produced by a scientific method, not a timestamp someone recorded at the time. Here is something that rarely makes it into a documentary. Radiocarbon dating cannot directly date most of the things archaeologists actually find. Stone tools cannot be dated this way. Neither can ceramic vessels, metal objects, or the walls of a building. Radiocarbon works exclusively on organic material, charcoal, bone, seeds, wood, and the ancient world left behind a great deal of material that simply doesn't qualify. That limitation alone is more significant than most popular accounts acknowledge. It shapes the entire conversation about how confidently we can assign ages to specific objects or events. But the deeper problem is not just what radiocarbon can date, it's the gap between dating a material and dating an event. When researchers find charcoal in a fire pit, what they are actually dating is the death of the tree that produced the charcoal, not the moment someone lit that particular fire. If a community was burning timber from old-growth trees that had been dead for a century before they were used as fuel, the radiocarbon result would suggest the fire is a century older than it actually is. Archaeologists call this the old wood problem. It is a genuine source of uncertainty in sites where timber was routinely stockpiled, reused or sourced from ancient stands of trees. Contamination is another variable that rarely gets discussed in accessible terms. but its effect on results can be significant. Organic samples can absorb carbon from surrounding soils, from groundwater, or from modern handling during excavation and preparation. Even small amounts of younger carbon introduced into an old sample will make it appear more recent than it actually is. Older carbon moving into a newer sample will push the result in the other direction. Laboratories go to considerable lengths to clean and pre-treat samples before analysis. But contamination is difficult to eliminate entirely. When a result looks anomalous, contamination is often the first explanation researchers consider. There is also a structural problem built into the calibration curve that underlies all radiocarbon dating. The decay of carbon-14 does not map onto calendar years in a perfectly smooth, predictable line. It fluctuates, and at certain periods in history, the curve essentially flattens out, meaning that a wide range of actual calendar years can produce nearly identical radiocarbon readings. These plateaus make it genuinely difficult to distinguish between events that may have happened a century apart. The period around 800 to 400 BC is a well-documented example of this, where the calibration curve is particularly flat and radiocarbon alone cannot resolve the chronology with any useful precision. What makes this more complicated is that two reputable laboratories analyzing the same sample with the same method can produce results that differ slightly from one another. These differences fall within accepted statistical ranges, but when the underlying date range is already several decades wide, even small laboratory variation can matter. The honest position most researchers take is that a reliable chronology typically requires several overlapping methods working in agreement, radiocarbon combined with stratigraphy, or dendrochronology cross-checking against written records where they exist. Each method has its own ceiling and its own blind spots. The most defensible dates emerge from convergence rather than from any single technique applied in isolation. This doesn't mean the dates A wrong. It means every date in ancient history carries a margin of uncertainty that is often wider than the confident phrasing in popular accounts suggests. In 1274 BC, the armies of Egypt and the Hittite Empire clashed near the city of Kadesh, in what was probably one of the largest chariot battles ever fought, and we have more surviving records from that single engagement than from almost any other event in the ancient Near East. There are poems, inscriptions, and detailed reliefs depicting the Egyptian forces routing their enemies in a tide of divine fury. And yet, if we actually look at what the Hittite records say, we find something striking. They claim the battle as their own victory. Both sides fought the same engagement, and both sides walked away convinced they had won. So which account does the historian trust? It is a window into how interpretation works at the very foundation of the discipline. The moment an archaeologist moves from describing what was found to explaining what it means, they have entered the territory of interpretation, and that territory has no clean borders. Consider what it actually looks like when excavators uncover a layer of burned material inside an ancient settlement. The burning is real. The ash is there. The charred timber is there. The collapsed mud brick is there. But the physical record does not come with a label explaining what caused it. It could be conquest. It could be an accidental fire that started in a storehouse and consumed an entire district before anyone could stop it. It could be a deliberate act of ritual destruction, which multiple ancient cultures practiced when a building was considered to have fulfilled its sacred function. The evidence for each of those explanations can look identical in the ground. What separates one conclusion from another is not the data itself, but the interpretive framework the researcher brings to it. This is where cultural analogy becomes both the most useful and the most dangerous tool in the archaeologist's kit. When a society leaves no written records, researchers often interpret its material remains by comparison with better documented cultures that appear to share similar characteristics. If two societies produce similar ceramic styles, similar settlement layouts, or similar burial practices, the reasoning goes that they may have shared similar social structures or beliefs. Often, though, it is a projection, and the history of the discipline is full of confident analogies that later turned out to reflect the assumptions of the researcher more than the reality of the people being studied. We have to be honest about the fact that using one culture to interpret another is always an inference, not a direct observation. Written sources add another layer of complexity, and not always in the direction you might expect. When a text and an excavation appear to confirm each other, that convergence is genuinely exciting, and it is part of how confidence in an interpretation builds over time. But texts can also actively mislead. Ancient administrative records were not produced to give future scholars a neutral account of events. They were produced to serve political, religious, or economic functions, which means the picture they present was already curated before it was ever carved into stone or pressed into clay. An inscription celebrating a military campaign tells you what the ruling authority wanted posterity to believe about that campaign. It does not necessarily tell you what happened. When archaeology contradicts a text, the instinct to defer to the written record can be a real obstacle to clearer thinking. And when two serious, methodologically rigorous scholars examine the same body of evidence and reach different conclusions, that disagreement is not evidence that one of them has made an error. It is evidence that the underlying data is genuinely ambiguous. This happens constantly in ancient history, and it is one of the things the field struggles to communicate to a wider audience that expects science to produce definitive answers. The physical remains of the ancient world were not arranged with interpretation in mind. A broken seal, a scatter of animal bones, a row of post holes in compacted soil. These things meant something specific to the people who created them, and that meaning is almost never recoverable with certainty. What we have instead are competing hypotheses, each built on archaeological evidence, each subject to revision the moment something new comes out of the ground. That is the normal condition of ancient history, not a clean answer waiting to be found, but a field of competing interpretations built on evidence that was never designed to be evidence in the first place. Every ancient record we have was created by someone, for a reason, and that reason was almost never to give future archaeologists an accurate picture of what life was actually like. The scribes who kept records in Mesopotamia were employed by temples and palace administrations. The officials who commissioned inscriptions in Egypt were answerable to a pharaoh. The people carving commemorative text into stone walls were not historians in any modern sense of the word. They were functionaries, propagandists, and administrators, and what they chose to write down was shaped almost entirely by the priorities of whoever was paying them. When we treat these documents as windows into the ancient world, we have to ask ourselves a harder question first. Whose ancient world, exactly, are we actually looking at? The Sumerian king list is a useful example of this problem. That document was not assembled to preserve a neutral administrative record. It was curated at specific political moments to legitimize the authority of particular rulers by connecting them to a divine and ancient lineage. The astronomical precision of those reigns, the careful mathematical structure of the SARS and NARS, the selection of which kings appear and which cities are mentioned, all of that reflects an agenda. It tells us a great deal about how the Sumerians thought about political authority and cosmic order. But we have to be careful about treating it as straightforward historical data, because the people who wrote it were not trying to be straightforward. They were trying to make a case. This same problem runs through almost every surviving textual source from the ancient world. We have more surviving records from the Battle of Kadesh than from almost any other engagement in the ancient Near East, but nearly all of those records are Egyptian, and nearly all of them describe the battle as a decisive victory for Rameses II. Hittite records tell a somewhat different story. If only one tradition had survived, our picture of that event would be confidently wrong, and we would have no way of knowing it. For most events in ancient history, only one tradition did survive, or none at all, which means the distortion is invisible precisely because there is nothing to compare it against. The geographic dimension of this problem is just as significant, and it's one that gets far less attention than it deserves. Dry climates preserve organic material in ways that wet climates simply do not. Egypt gives us papyrus, linen, wooden furniture, and human remains intact enough for DNA analysis, because the Nile Valley happens to create conditions that slow decomposition dramatically. Equally sophisticated cultures in wetter regions of sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, or temperate Europe built in wood, wove cloth, stored knowledge in ways that left nothing durable behind, and the archaeological record of those regions is dramatically thinner as a result. It is not that those societies were simpler or less organized. It is that the climate destroyed the evidence. What survives is not proportional to what existed. It is proportional to what the environment happened to spare. The same logic applies to monumental architecture. Pyramids, temple complexes, and stone fortifications survive for millennia, precisely because they were built to survive. They were built by societies with the surplus labor and centralized organization to construct them, which means they are inherently markers of wealth and power. They tell us where concentrated authority existed, not necessarily where sophisticated human activity was most widespread. It creates a situation where the civilizations that left the most impressive physical traces dominate our picture of the ancient world, while societies that built in wood, buried their dead simply, or kept no written records are effectively invisible. In 2010, LiDAR surveys over the jungles of Cambodia began producing images that rewrote what historians thought they knew about the scale of the Khmer Empire. Beneath centuries of forest canopy, the scans revealed an urban network so extensive and so densely organized that it dwarfed every previous estimate of the empire's population and reach. Archaeologists had been working at Angkor for over 100 years. They had excavated temples, mapped roads, and published detailed accounts of what they believed was a well-understood civilization. It is a story about what happens when the tools available to a discipline finally catch up with the complexity of the record it is trying to read. The same pattern has repeated itself across the field with remarkable consistency. Ancient DNA analysis, which only became viable at scale within the last decade or so, has forced historians to revise migration narratives that were considered settled for generations. Population movements that scholars had reconstructed through artifact typology and architectural similarities turned out to be far more complicated once genetic sequencing entered the picture. Groups that were assumed to have spread particular technologies across regions were sometimes found to have had no genetic connection to the populations that eventually adopted those same technologies. The biological record and the material record do not always tell the same story, and when they diverge, the discipline has to sit with this at ambiguity rather than paper over it. Ground-penetrating radar has produced similar disruptions at sites that archaeologists believed they understood well. Surveys at Stonehenge in 2014 identified dozens of previously unknown buried monuments within the surrounding landscape, suggesting that the site functioned within a much larger ceremonial complex than anyone had mapped. These weren't new sites that had never been studied. They were invisible features sitting beneath ground that researchers had walked across for decades, undetected because the technology to find them didn't yet exist. If we apply that principle broadly, and we should, the implication is straightforward. What we don't know about most ancient sites almost certainly exceeds what we do know. Here's the problem with how archaeology gets communicated to the public. Revision tends to read as failure. When a textbook account turns out to be wrong or significantly incomplete, the instinct is to ask why they got it wrong in the first place. But that framing misunderstands how the discipline actually works. A conclusion reached in 1970 using the methods available in 1970 is not an error corrected in 2024. It is a hypothesis that was reasonable given the available evidence and has since been updated by better evidence. The researchers who produced those earlier accounts were not being careless. They were working at the edge of what was knowable at the time, which is what every generation of archaeologists is doing right now. The conclusions being published today will themselves be revised, refined, and in some cases overturned. And that is precisely what it looks like when a discipline is functioning correctly. What changes the picture is not just new technology. Interpretive frameworks shift between generations of scholars, and those shifts reshape what the existing evidence appears to mean. Objects and sites that one generation read as evidence of centralized political authority have been reinterpreted by the next as evidence of ritual practice, or of trade networks, or of something else entirely. The evidence didn't change, the questions being asked of it did. That is why ancient history is not a fixed body of knowledge that accumulates steadily in one direction. It is an ongoing negotiation between a limited physical record and the interpretive tools of the people examining it. What archaeology offers is not a final answer about the ancient world. It is the most rigorous, evidence-based version of our current best guess. And in this field, that is both the limitation and the point.